clearing the table, yeah? Ready, go. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Wait, I got a strong voice, as you can tell, yeah? Those of you that know me know this already anyways. I'm not quite sure where I'm going to go with this. I am going to tell you that Money J has filled me with so many addendums to my introduction that I kind of felt as though I was in church. Because you go through the Mass, and I know this only because my son's a chorister. You go through the Mass, and then what happens is at the end, before you're set off, the priest tells you all the little notes. There's a cake sale downstairs and everything else. I'm going to reverse this, guys. So I'm going to give you the cake sale information first, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what you're here for. So there are 3 notes of importance. One is that each of you on your chair has got something that looks like this, quite probably. This is a program guide for the AA public program, which Money J has this has just begun this year, this little book you can carry around in your back pocket. She hopes that there may be some repeat people out of this book. So in actual fact, take this book away and look what's coming up in the future as well, okay? That's note number 1. Second note is that, no, I'm going to save the second note because that's going to work for the intro. Third note, or second note in this order, is that following the lecture, don't go anywhere because there's going to be a
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for this super enthusiastic introduction. What we're going to do is we're going to introduce the book, explain a little bit maybe also the ideas behind the book, some of the driving thoughts, zoom into two aspects of the book that we find interesting, important, vital, central. One Ingrid is going to do and one by me, and then ask Alex and Rachel to join us to have an open conversation, and then also, of course, you to join. I think I'm just going to start jumping right in. African Modernism, Architecture of Independence. Independence is a huge topic. It's a kind of a white elephant, and I love this picture because it somehow doesn't say much, but it does hint or let's say bring maybe to the surface a few of the ambiguities, a few of the difficulties also about independence. This is Queen Elizabeth coming to Ghana in 1961, sitting next to Kwame Nkrumah, the president of Ghana. 1961 is 3 years after, or 4 years, just about 4 years after independence. You think, like, why does she come 4 years after independence and not for independence? Did she miss the plane? Or I don't know, why didn't she participate in the celebration? But still, you see this kind of joining. You see Nkrumah in this kind of pride, the champion of independence of Sub-Saharan Africa, is proud to show her this kind of gorgeous queen with a weird hat. The country, but you also see, I don't know, maybe a certain kind of distance between them. I don't know, it somehow speaks a little bit of this big topic of independence, which we'll try to unravel a little bit. And to start, I would like to say, maybe there's even something like a geography of independence. If we look at which countries did become independent in the 50s and 60s and before and after, we see that there is a geographical zone. Maybe by coincidence, maybe not. But if in orange all the countries are marked that became independent in the kind of hot ages of independence between 1957 and the mid-60s, we see really this kind of coincidence, geographical coincidence of the tropics. It is not Algeria is the exception, and it is really an exception because it was the most violent, bloody, and most tragic kind of process of independence on that continent. It really, in these 7 years, the central part of the continent, the tropical part of the continent became independent. And the main thesis maybe of the book and of us is that architecture was used consciously as a means to express independence, as a means of nation building, of expressing a new national identity. And this is just to illustrate this with this amazing FIDAC, Foire Internationale de Dakar, an exhibition center in Dakar, or just north of Dakar, which is maybe a fantastic example, one of the best examples of that period, showcasing this incredible craft of architecture that was created in this time that we were really amazed by and wanted to research. We researched it in 5 countries. Chris named them. Ghana, the first one to become independent of Sub-Saharan Africa in 1957, Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire, Kenya and Zambia, thereby spanning the continent geographically from west to east to south, and looking at the 2 former colonial powers, France and Britain, as kind of their political and cultural potential influence. We produced a book out of that, which basically documents architecture, because documentation is maybe a value, a worth in its own, when we know that almost none of these buildings are known, certainly not in the West. So we were documenting them maybe for some of the first time, certainly since a few decades. We came across really amazingly stunning things. And then the book includes a series of essays, critical essays that try to expand on the geography, that try to zoom into certain topics, and also kind of critically assess some of the themes that the book touches upon. It is also an exhibition currently on show at Vitra and planning to travel, which has a documentary and archival section on the wall, 5 countries, 80 picture boxes, every building is a box, every box is a building, and featuring contemporary photography by Ivan Ban and Alexia Webster, South African photographer, both good friends of ours, and let's say historiographical section in a long table which concentrates on 5 buildings, again unraveling some of the themes which we also want to do now. And of course, let's say the 2 major themes are mentioned in the title and the subtitle of the book, which is independence and modernism, or modernization maybe. And if we start with the first term, and I'm just going to touch very briefly and maybe oversimplifying a little bit, forgive me for that, on some of these terms before Ingrid takes over. The word of independence is, of course, in the foreground. It features, it becomes almost programmatic in the architecture. It becomes almost programmatic, for example, in this building, which is Hôtel Indépendance, Hotel of Independence in Dakar, on the Square of Independence. So the name is a program. But immediately, when we look a little bit further, the kind of complexities, or I wouldn't say complexities and contradictions, that's someone else's term, but nevertheless, these kinds of shades of gray emerge. This is the same architect, Henri Chaumette, a French architect who went to Western Africa when he was in his 30s, who built 150 buildings in Western Africa, incredibly talented. We probably haven't heard of him here. He built this Hôtel de Ville, the town hall of Abidjan, main city of the Ivory Coast, 2 years before the Ivory Coast became independent. So you could say it is a colonial project. It is a product of colonialism, but it is exactly this location, the plaza in front of the town hall, that President Houphouët-Boigny, the first president of the Côte d'Ivoire, was standing when he announced independence, when he declared his country to become independent. So ever since then, even though being a colonial product, the building has kind of become to stand as a symbol of this act of declaring independence. And this goes on, and we can, of course, pinpoint so many of these buildings, but the Kenyatta International Conference Center is another beautiful example, stunning architecture by a Norwegian architect, Carl-Henrik Nostvik, where the building was consciously used as a kind of tool of nation building, where through the construction of the building, by having the first annual meeting of the World Bank and the IMF take place on the African continent in this building, it allowed the country to further the ties to kind of a national network of nations, of institutions, to really kind of connect the country to the globe. And somehow the building speaks of that, or the architecture speaks of that, we believe. This idea of the future of modernization features very strongly in the architecture, again also in the names. This is La Pyramide, Italian architect standing in the center of Abidjan. I guess we do relate this pyramidal, on the one hand archaic, but also futuristic architecture with something really optimistic, extravagant. The same city features Alpha 2000. What could be more futuristic than Alpha 2000? But if someone builds a building called Alpha 2000, the next one has to come and name his building Postel 2001. So the building on the very right is almost like a competition of who can be more advanced, who can be more in the future, who can be more kind of a subscriber to this thing of modernization. But modernization, of course, in this context was not, let's say, was not neutral, was not was debatable, because modernization maybe could be called also the fig leaf of the colonial project in the first case. Now, the British and the French came to Africa, colonized Africa with the excuse of modernizing it, of bringing civilization to the dark continent. And the promised schools never came, and the promised modernization never arrived. So one could also question, why was modernization picked up almost unanimously by the independent nations and by the architecture by extension? And the building you're looking at is maybe brings this also to a little sort of almost conflict. It is the Kenyatta Tea Association, the Chai House. It's, first of all, one of the most amazing kind of arrangements of functions that one could find. The building part on the left is the administration building of this tea association. The UFO-shaped volume is a discotheque, was the best discotheque in town, and below that is a petrol station. So it's a wonderful kind of assemblage of functions. But Kenya is maybe one of the cases where there was let's say an alternative attempt of independence process with the Mau Mau movement that was maybe could be described as anti-modern. We can debate about that. And Kenyatta, who was on the one hand part of this Mau Mau movement, when he became president of Kenya, tried to present a very modernistic image, even though the tea farmers, this going a little bit too much into detail, the tea farmers were extremely efficient without modern agricultural technology, and he tried to kind of rein them in, also using architecture to modernize this agriculture and present a very modernistic image to the world, so that there was no doubt about this notion of modernization. Again, architecture was used as a tool of nation building, beautifully exemplified by this National Assembly of Zambia in Lusaka, where the parliamentarians join, probably unique in this world, the floor with a tiger and a lion. Let's say alternative modes and arrangements of kind of seeking your way through this League of Nations was sought at that time, and Zambia is maybe a good example where the non-aligned movement was very strong. Yugoslavian architects, as one of the founding nations of the non-aligned movement, were very active. This Findeco building also houses the industrial organization that is the result of nationalization of local industry. Zambia became a kind of affected by the Cold War, even indirectly through the crash of Dag Hammarskjöld, the acting, Chancellor of the United Nations, who crashed trying to kind of solve one of the central conflicts of the Cold War. This is the memorial to him in northern Zambia. And again, we come back to this idea of decolonization, of national identity, of independence, when we see this fantastic cathedral, Anglican Cathedral, 1962, built in the center of Lusaka. And you wonder, beyond, of course, the purpose that it serves to the local population, giving a space for religious activity, why did the British invest so much money 2 years before independence to construct this beautiful Anglican cathedral when it was anyway clear that Northern Rhodesia would become independent, would become Zambia? Is it a generous farewell gift that you give like to a friend who leaves home, so to say? Is it a last futile attempt to woo the population over, to convince them not to become independent? Hey, look at what beautiful spaces you'll get if you stay with us, British? Or is it a kind of a Trojan horse that tries to implement Anglican religion, Anglican culture, English culture that would last beyond colonial rule, and architecture becomes a tool in that? I don't know what the answer is. It's probably a combination of all three of that, but it shows how architecture is never innocent, how architecture is never just for the pure enjoyment of the aesthetics, but is always involved somehow in the political games that are played. And this is what we find so fascinating with this. I'll hand over to Ingrid, who will kind of take this topic a little bit further.
Okay. Obviously, our trips to Africa were always illuminating. And I always feel that talking to an audience, I look out and I can see, some of you may be unfamiliar with the architecture of Africa, and some of you may be far more familiar than we are. And I think that this is an opportunity to open up a few questions, and please, after we finish, please feel free to challenge us and to inform us, because this is a continuing learning process. One of the things that fascinated me as we began producing the information for the book is this kind of really problematic transition between the colonial period and the post-colonial period. This image was used actually by Mark Crinzen in his book on the kind of Age of Empire. It was published in 1953 in an architectural review. It was entitled The African Experiment. And I think that this is a very kind of problematic term in relation to how one begins to examine architecture within Africa, and particularly the modernist movement. Obviously in the 50s, and preceding this actually in the late 40s, people like Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew were working and doing quite significant work, particularly in places like Ghana and Nigeria, and seeking to find a language that was a universal language that found its regionalism through an understanding of climate, through an understanding of the needs of a kind of a tropical environment. And the seeds of that actually became the seeds of the Tropical School of Architecture here at the AA. And certainly in our trips to various African countries, we kept on encountering architects who had done their masters here and had extraordinary stories. But this is a problematic idea in itself, that there is a kind of one school where you learn architecture, and one school where you learn architecture for an entire continent, let alone the tropical regions of Asia and South America. But out of that comes quite a fascinating application of those principles that begin to take on, I don't know if one would call a flavor, but a character that is specific to its location. This is the Mfantsipim School by Fry and Drew in Ghana. And what you'll see here is almost the elements that you saw in the previous image. So this was actually constructed several years later. But the components, the screening, the kind of the thinness of the plan, the idea to incorporate aspects of natural ventilation, and then the structure of a school in order to create an idea of a new community was happening right at the cusp of the independence period. And what I think is fascinating about this is that just at a time when national identity was seeking to become specific, it was using a language or exploiting a language that was intended as universal. But then I think the combination of this idea of universality and the particular nature of nationhood is something to be understood within a much wider context. What we tend to forget when we talk about tropical modernism and the architecture of Africa is that it's such an obvious comment, but when the African nations were becoming independent, they were part of a kind of a global liberation movement. We found this image, which I think to me sums up the spirit of that age. This is President Senghor, who is the first president of Senegal, speaking in Harlem. You can just spot Malcolm X in the corner on the far right. And this idea that identity was not necessarily a national identity, but was perhaps a global racial identity that had a kind of problematic relationship to place, because this was a kind of a race of potential diaspora, forced diaspora, as well as willing diaspora, that had a potentially very difficult relationship with its origins. And I think to me, and within this project, that spirit has been also embodied in the development of the architecture. Coming out of this urge to modernize that Manuel was talking about happens in a number of ways. This is Nkrumah, showing the massive, as it says, Volta River project. This was a project that was intended to essentially liberate Ghana from the need to acquire external energy sources. In fact, obviously most of that energy was used to refine aluminium through the Kaiser Aluminium Company, which was an American-owned company, and actually forced Ghana into significant amounts of debt. But there was an ambition that was a twofold ambition, and what I'm sort of trying to illustrate here is that for Nkrumah, the ambition to harness the spirit of an age to focus on issues of, say, national education, the kind of harnessing of resources for the kind of future good of a country was incredibly valuable. Unfortunately, it took its toll, and that kind of massiveness of vision became equated with a sort of authoritarianism in which really saw the end to Nkrumah, whose reputation has since been recovered. But this is the sort of the massive parade ground that is in Accra, still stands at the moment, is still used. But it became sort of synonymous with this bid for mass power. And unfortunately, this sort of world of modernization, the world of the modern architects, became synonymous with a sort of authoritarian aspect of new government. But the story is not so simple, and I think when we come to look not just at these big infrastructure projects, but actually at the spirit of what informed the architectural character of these buildings, we kind of bring in the world of kind of Francophone Africa. I'll have to get the exact source for this. Hang on. This is a wonderful translation. It's a translation of a poem by Dama, which was written in 1937. And with this, I just wanted to introduce this idea of what it was to be both French and African, in this case, for a lot of people who were coming from Senegal, but also from the Caribbean. The image behind this is of a meeting of African leaders at the Élysée Palace in Paris. And you can read it for yourself, but this idea of things taking shape, the shape of a well-done camembert. He says, "Then I will make you angry, or simply grab by the collar all that bother me, colonization, civilization, assimilation, and the rest. For now, you'll often hear me slam the door." Out of this world of kind of slamming the door on the kind of colonial past, but accepting the fact that one belongs to an assimilated past as well, brings this kind of incredible kind of layered complexity to the work that we saw in Africa. This is a really exceptional tapestry by Papa Ibertol, from Senegal, that was eventually displayed in the 1968 Montreal Expo. So came to represent one part of one country in Africa, alongside some more traditional so-called kind of primitive arts. At this stage, a lot of the kind of African leaders had spent a tremendous amount of time either in the United States or within Europe. A lot of them had been educated in Paris, in London, in the northeast of the United States. And actually reconciling this tradition with the kind of imposed tradition of colonial architecture and the ambitions for sort of infrastructural development create this sort of incredible experimental ground, and not necessarily the applied experiment that I was showing you in the first image with the kind of the drawing done for the architectural review, but within the kind of collaboration between architects. This is another project by Henri Chaumet. And what's interesting about Chaumet is that he wasn't just working as a singular architect. In each country, he worked with a kind of assemblage of craftsmen, of local builders, etc. And the kind of the physical expression that one sees perhaps in the tapestries of Tol can be taken through into the understanding of a kind of layered material treatment within this incredible roof structure in the sort of the business school in Dakar. Coming out of this, though, this is not just the layering of materials and the kind of decorative components, but this is the Hotel Independence, again in Dakar, again by Chaumet, where the sort of expression, the patterned expression, is somehow fused with the needs of the climate. This is kind of shading device made into a kind of extreme sort of sculptural facade. Sadly, and we can come back to this topic later, this is now completely empty. It's squatted, it's an incredibly beautiful building that's sitting on one of the most important corners in the city, and really pretty much falling into the ground. Out of this, though, comes again a kind of a combination of a concern for rethinking materials, for rethinking the potential sculptural form, and in this case, rethinking the kind of site of things like education. These are a series of auditorium buildings at the university in Dakar that from afar become these sort of very simple sculptural forms, but are in fact embedded with shells, which then speak of the sort of kind of coastal edge condition. I know Manuel showed this image earlier, but this is a little bit later in the 70s with the International Fair, where that kind of combination of form actually becomes the vehicle for the application of the kind of artist development of the facade. alongside this, what is absolutely fascinating is President Senghor instituted a planning initiative, or planning guidance, I suppose, that architecture was to adhere to the principle of asymmetric parallelism, which was a fantastic sort of 60s, I suppose, contradiction in terms. That this is a president who was a poet, and a good one. So the idea that one's principles come out of a kind of poetic ambiguity, I think, is absolutely the sort of spirit of the age and something we rarely see anymore. I'm going to hand over back to Manuel to come to the...
Maybe before we ask Rachel and Alex to join us, I'd like to just zoom into one particular building, which maybe is a good example to kind of see how this architecture can also be used as almost like a litmus test for the events that were going on there, which is the Hotel Ivoire. What is the Hotel Ivoire? This comic kind of tells a good, or gives us a good introduction. It's a few images taken from a comic book, Aya, which tells the story of the youth of Abidjan, biggest city of the Ivory Coast in the 1970s, exactly at the time that we were looking at. We see Bintou, the girl here in the foreground, walking to a date to meet Grégoire, who is just an Ivoirian who has just come back from Paris. So he has seen the world, he has been to the greatest capital that the world knows, he's come back to find a wife. Bintou has a date with Grégoire, and of course she can't neither resist the seduction of Grégoire nor the beauty of the Hotel Ivoire, which is the most glamorous location in the city, where everybody who is rich, who can afford it, takes a room, and overlooking the marina or the bay of Abidjan, she falls in love with him and kisses him. Later, of course, tragically, she finds out that he's a fake, that he can't even afford the hotel room, and it all ends in tears. But the Hotel Ivoire doesn't. The Hotel Ivoire is a project initiated by Houphouët-Boigny right after independence, really as a hotel to host guests, to host tourists. It is and businessmen. It is financed by an Israeli investor, designed by two Israeli architects, Heinz Fenchel and Thomas Leitersdorfer, together with a Californian architect, William Pereira. And together they create this incredible, almost universe world that somehow marries modernism with some kind of expression of locality, supposedly maybe, let's say, traditional, quote-unquote, traditional forms and shapes. The Hotel Ivoire, I think, can be seen in combination or in connection with a series of hotels that were built in several other countries of Sub-Saharan Africa. We've seen this hotel now a number of times, the Hotel Independence. And Hotel Independence, not only being the name of this specific building, could almost be a building typology, because almost every country of Sub-Saharan Africa constructed one of these glamorous hotels, because it was also a tool of nation building. It enabled countries to host visitors, to host politicians, to host events, to host parties, but also political events. So we see the Hotel Ivoire Hotel Independence in Dakar. We see the Hilton Hotel built right after independence in Nairobi. We see the by now unfortunately gutted glamorous hotel in Liberia, in help me out, capital of Liberia, Monrovia. Sorry, thank you. So and we see it in several other countries. This kind of building as a tool to connect to the wider world, and we see this glamorous interior. Now back to the Hotel Ivoire, designed by Heinz Fenchel, who was in fact theater design, or came out of this tradition of theater design, stage design, interior design, creating this beautiful universe. He was in his 60s when he did design the hotel, and you see almost a kind of a re-radicalization of his architectural language, developing really fantastic and experimenting with fantastic forms and shapes, like these ones, patterns with which he wanted to design, and eventually did design, the big conference center that forms part of the hotel, which is really a complex, a world of its own, just outside of the city limits or the central city area of Abidjan, creating a world of its own to kind of create both an idea of modernism and an appearance of local Africa. But Houphouët-Boigny wanted much more. His dreams were much bigger. And he developed something that he called the African Riviera. He thought, if we are independent, we are on eye level with any other nation on this planet. So we can, if the French have their Riviera, we can construct our own Riviera on the African Riviera. And together with the architects who had already designed the hotel, he designed this huge master plan, which is a kind of a very elaborate book that was published in 1970. And it starts off with this drawing, which I find incredibly beautiful in a way, because it puts Abidjan in the center of the world. And every city is somehow connected to it by a few flight hours from Paris, from New York, from Moscow, or from Johannesburg. You arrive in Abidjan. And we might smile about it, we might detect a certain naivety, but there's such a kind of a sincerity also to this, to say, no, we belong to the world, and we are now one of the new centers of it. And then he designed this master plan, or the architects designed this master plan. I won't go into the details, but it was very much kind of framed again on notions of modernity, on the Garden City movement. It was supposed to house 200,000 inhabitants, beyond the, 50,000 tourists that would come every year to spend their holidays there. It featured any kind of exotic or not exotic transport infrastructure that we can find. The housing areas merged with schools and education. It was very much building up a center of education, commerce. This is the so-called civic center in the center of this new city development. Of course, it was not virgin land where this new city was supposed to be built. About 10,000 inhabitants, Ivoirian inhabitants, lived in this area, in 5 traditional villages, and they were supposed to be dislocated. They were supposed to be, let's say, displaced, brought into the villages, into the new housing developments, supposed to be modernized through a transition of housing typologies, where they were supposed to learn kind of the features of modern life, of a kitchen, of a living room, of a bedroom, and so on. It is maybe no coincidence that Thomas Leitersdorfer, who was involved in this planning of, let's say, displacement, later became one of the very active planners in Israel, planning in the Palestinian territories, displacing the Palestinians for Israeli settlements. The area also featured a big playground, a big Disneylandish kind of environment, where if you modernize everything, then Africa needs to be exhibited. So the traditional methods, crafts, dancing styles were to be exhibited in some kind of Disneyland area, where the tourists with their canoes would kind of drive from dancing to dancing. The whole thing was never built because of political but also financial reasons, but Hotel Ivoire flourished. It did become the most glamorous hotel of Western Africa. It was the platform for many political events. Many debates and conferences were held there, and it kind of followed parallel the development of the country. It is quite interesting even to look at just the postcards that were issued at that time. This is from the 1960s, where it was maybe kind of exoticized. In the 1970s, it was represented as a tourist destination, and in the 1990s, it became a business, or it wanted to present itself as a business destination. It followed the ups of the country, but it also followed the downs of the country. And when in the 1990s, the country kind of developed into internal conflict. It fell out of use and became the base of militias of Côte d'Ivoire, which used the tower almost strategically as a base to control the region. And it saw maybe its most tragic moment in history when, I don't know if this should play somehow, when in 2004 it became the base of French UN soldiers, which occupied the hotel, used it as a base, and from the hotel shot around 20 Ivoirians who were demonstrating against the presence of the French in the country. So it was almost used like a tool, an instrument of urban conflict, of urban warfare. And 2009 it was renovated again and reopened 2011, and tries to link back to its glamorous past, as these images by Ivan kind of witness. So with this romantic view back over the bay, what one could claim is, first of all, that the building is almost like, tells a parallel story of the country. It's almost like the alter ego of the country, and that we can maybe see this architecture, not only this building, but many of the other buildings, as a way to unravel the complexities of this independence process of the post-independence era, that they are almost act like a device to detect the contradictions of this process. And with the closed book, I would now like to invite Rachel and Alex to join us here on the table.
By way of introduction, obviously we'd like to start a conversation between the four of us, but also we hope that some of the topics we've raised today are not simply nice to look at, but often difficult and perhaps disagreeable. I think not everyone would agree with the same position we've taken or the way in which you represented it, and I think we'd be very welcome to take comments or have you included in the discussion that we initiate.
Can I start?
Yeah.
The book's really beautiful, and it's a really big book, not just the size of it, but the amount and density of conversation we could have. Like, it's very loaded. So I wondered whether we could just open up the discussion by asking you guys a bit more about your methods and your motivations for doing the book. The themes of independence, post-colonialism, identity, etc. are really big. Did you start with those themes and go specifically to look at the architecture of them? Or did you start by thinking, we want to photograph architecture of this period, and then through that you discovered and encountered these themes? And the second part of the question was then the method of using photography, and specifically Ewan Barnes' photography, to work with and represent buildings and architecture, as opposed to maybe a more historical or drawings-based analysis of architecture in this period.
Maybe I start with the first part of your question, and thanks for them, they're super relevant. Well, there's a, let's say, anecdotal, biographical, not biographical, but an anecdotal response to your question. I did travel quite a lot to the areas of Sub-Saharan Africa, and became aware of this incredible oeuvre, of this incredible wealth of architectural production, especially in Nairobi, which was until then unknown to me, and I thought also unknown at least to the West. And this connection with the time of independence made it super interesting. So it was neither nor, it wasn't only the architecture that drove, and we didn't start with a thesis. I don't think you can do that, but there was a hunch that the quality of the architecture that we eventually saw and witnessed comes with also a baggage, and comes with an incredibly interesting, fascinating theoretical and socio-political dimension that needs to be investigated and that allows us also to, let's say, reveal a whole different dimension onto these countries of the African continent that we usually like to ignore.
I think I could add to that a little in that, again, somewhat anecdotally. There are people who work on Africa and they do exceptional work, and they do fully academic work where they, certainly there's some people like Hannah LaRue and, as you mentioned earlier, Ola Adoku, who have done, gone into the archives, spent a huge amount of time really uncovering the processes of the design of these buildings, etc. And that work is incredibly significant and academically incredibly valid. But what we found when we were simply just trying to create some sort of itinerary is trying to find the buildings was a task in itself. And there's a kind of first instance of simply attempting to, I suppose, uncover a critical mass of work that is otherwise not available. And in the first instance, I hope that this is not just a sort of summary of what African modernism is, because I can't think a book could do that, but a starting point for further research for people who have an interest in this kind of field. And I think that, we've certainly discussed, and I think we've discussed in the past, this use of photography, and particularly something like Ivan Ban, which may bring up some other issues. Obviously, there's a prevailing current interest in the sort of the life of global cities. And I think someone like Ivan is known for and preoccupied with the sort of humanizing of the sort of architectural object. And for us, this was an interesting way of bringing several themes together. One, having exceptional photographs of buildings that allow people to understand those buildings without recourse to the sort of conventional plans and sections, but also to contextualize that work through a sort of a relatively light touch, and also to demonstrate perhaps the position of these buildings within their context, because not everybody loves these buildings, and not all of these buildings are loved to the same degree. And hopefully through the photography there's an opportunity to, I suppose, for the reader to understand those relationships at a kind of a wider level.
Maybe just to add one more thought. You mentioned these two ways of writing history of a building, and in a way one could say we try to do a little bit both. We also do the proper one of featuring sketches of the architect in some of the essays that we include in the book. We show what is the architect inspired by, we show what was he sketching, what did he build before he came to Africa. But you could also ask, who cares? Who cares about the architect? Why do we need to look at what he's inspired by? This is not important, especially because it is architecture that is implemented at the time of independence, at the process or in the process of decolonization. We should rather look at how the architecture is kind of adapted there, adopted there, how it arrives there, how it's not an export of architecture book. It is a silly game of words, rather hopefully more an import of architecture book.
Yeah, I think one thing that really struck me when I was first looking at it was obviously the images, but the images almost being just as if it was like a road trip, that it was the situation that you found the building in. And when you said you were working on this book and there are going to be lots of images, and you were sort of expecting historical photographs that were staged that represented the building at the point of independence or the point of a particular ceremony or a historic kind of act or something. And then they weren't, which was quite surprising and quite nice. And in a way, they're not historical because they're kind of photos that you took now, so they're sort of opening as many questions as they are kind of visualizing images of the ideals of the past. But I wanted to ask, was it a road trip? I mean, how long did you take? How did you organize it? You said it was difficult to organize, so was it all done in 2 months, or were there several different trips, or how much red tape did you have to go through to get to a building? Did you plan the photos beforehand, or were you just wandering around taking millions of photos and then sorting through them? What was the kind of method of that?
Well, the trips we did, say, a trip every 6 months. month-ish. Well, no, 3 to 4 months. So we did, 4 or 5 trips over 2.5 years. And that entailed basically entailed trying to find buildings in aerial photographs that might be interesting and starting to track them down. The fantastic thing, I think this goes for all of the developing world, is the conversations that you have with people is where the knowledge is. And as soon as we arrived, we found, say, 100 times more work than we had planned for. The question then is, what is a significant building? And I think that what's sort of hidden behind the images in the book is an attempt to understand, A, the development of the cities that these buildings are in, and the ambitions of their original move towards independence. So as I mentioned before, someone like Nkrumah is a kind of infrastructural leader. So, his work comes out in the big kind of government buildings, in the big projects for sort of, the kind of communist nations, actually, et cetera, and for a huge policy for building schools. So what one then begins to select is attempting to try and find a sort of a spirit of the age. And then in terms of red tape, bureaucracy, Manuel maybe can tell our Abidjan story, but
I'll tell the Abidjan
yes,
story.
Exactly. But other than that, I think that, I suppose like anywhere else, the relationships that one builds while you're there were absolutely fundamental and incredibly fascinating.
And
So
you wanted the images and the writing, I suppose, to be a product of that.
Exactly.
Almost as found.
Yeah.
The photographers kind of followed in our footsteps mostly. This is Alexia. She traveled with us, but Ivan traveled kind of 2 weeks after us, which makes sense because we needed to kind of open doors. We needed to find the buildings. Very little archival material exists. A little bit does exist, but we had to, sometimes find them. Regarding red tape, Ingrid told me to tell this one beautiful story. Or maybe not beautiful. It's concerning this building in the center of Abidjan. I was before we were going to the Ivory Coast, I wrote the Swiss ambassador to the Ivory Coast, telling him we're coming with a group of students and just informing him. And he wrote me, and this was like a week before traveling. He wrote me back almost hateful letter saying, well, thank you for your information, Mr. Herz, but I would recommend you not to come. It's really unsafe here. Something that just happened in Nairobi, in the shopping mall incident can easily happen here. And well, it's none of my business, but the architecture that you mention in your email, for example, La Pyramide, is a disgrace to the country. It's a rat hole. It should be torn down. The only thing that was built in this country is the highway between Abidjan and Yamoussoukro, and that was by Swiss engineers. Why do you have so much money anyway? Spend it in Europe and look at good architecture in Europe. Of course, we had to kind of diplomatically cancel the trip because this letter was also sent to basically the Swiss Minister of Education. And then we traveled independently, informally, and saw the city that is one of the most breathtaking and fantastic cities of the African continent, and some of the best buildings there. So just a little anecdote to the red tape, but also the kind of the incredible prejudices that we in Europe have.
Why did you say you wanted to tear it down?
It's a rat hole. It's squatted.
Why did you say that?
It's out of use. I don't know. It's one.
Maybe that's quite a valid question to ask why. And I think that in the book, the kind of one thing to approach looking at these cities in the kind of way of shells of kind of something from the past. But I think it would have been a bit helpful also, perhaps, these questions of what are the attitudes now, kind of contextualizing this in today's dialogues and conversations. And I, from experience in certain projects, you found that quite often you had people who would, really have this attitude, which in many ways you can understand the same way that, as you talk about in the book, a big drive in the modernist time was to try to meet themselves parallel to other countries in the world. So perhaps some people who view it in the light that you're now, such as China wants to have towers like the West, the same way of wanting to be on that same parallel. But then you do find that, I did find that in some of the interviews we did were actually in the markets where people were kind of informally selling, and they did recognize the importance of, you know, what this represents of part of their history, and perhaps we can just maybe put this in a different zone. We can zone the newer buildings and keep the, so I think that people, in the mind in terms of ideas. But I think that people were quite open to talking about it. It wasn't just, sometimes we do think quite often, and the stories that do get told from mostly conservative middle class will be that, hey, that's of the past, you know? Whereas if you do go and meet people, they do actually, who maybe sit in the market and sell all day long. And I'm talking of an experience, a market called Kariakou in Tanzania. They really loved being in that space, you know, they really appreciated the coolness of it, and they were able to talk about the experience of the building, not being architects.
But I think this is also a really difficult problem in that the larger scale buildings and the things that they represent are problematic everywhere. They're not just problematic in Africa. Sorry, do you ask a question?
Well, my name is Manuel. I've been teaching, I have been teaching in the university, well, the architecture school in Rwanda for 4 years. And I went with my, with the students. We went to Nairobi, we went to Dar es Salaam, we went to the Kariakou market. And, well, I was wondering, like, apart from fascination out of this architecture that I understand, you said that you didn't find a lot of information of these buildings. And what struck me when we started the architecture school in Rwanda was new when I started teaching there. And we looked a lot of what was being taught in Tanzania, in Kenya. And what struck me and most of the teachers was that the architecture history has very little of their own architecture, right? So I suppose that's one of the reasons why you didn't find a lot of architecture. But that leads me to the point that Rachel was saying, that like when you talk to people that live these buildings, and the conception is very different, but when you talk to educated people that has another level of economical level, let's say, they don't even study this in the universities, right? So I think that that's a good point to raise, and that would be interesting. And I think it would be, I don't know, I imagine you are, but like, I don't know if the exhibition and lectures like that are being exposed in places in Africa, but I think that places like the university in Kigali or Burundi, Uganda, that have very little resources of bibliography, it would be very interesting, and especially to raise this point of like, what is quality architecture, right? You're saying this is very like the quality of these buildings, but they are squatted. Like, what is quality? We consider quality.
Well, they're not, I mean, a few of them are squatted.
Well, yeah.
But I think also, I mean, what brings me to one really interesting point, which is I also think that if you look at the KNUST in Kumasi, the university in Kumasi, you know, when that was built, and the architects that were coming out of that school were in conversation with, you know, incredible sociologists, incredible philosophers, etc., who were also the kind of the leaders of the country. At the moment, architecture is not an issue for discussion, and certainly when we were in Dakar, the work that the students were doing, they start with modeling colonial buildings in Dakar, which is deeply problematic.
No, I mean, it's perfectly correct. It's maybe one interest of this project of the book is also, yes, to raise awareness, not only here, but also to create this kind of archive. We have about 10,000 photos that we took, and Ivan and Alexia took, to create an archive that kind of preserves and preserves a certain kind of evaluation, good and bad, of these buildings. And I think you see the whole range. You see, I'm just kind of flipping through some photos. You see something like this, Jane Drew and Maxwell Fry, community center in Accra, built before independence, nevertheless, totally neglected, a huge shame, ignored. But you also see that. You see a kind of almost paying homage, a reverence of Nairobi, the KICC, which is acknowledged, I believe, not only amongst certain groups of the society, but across the nation as the symbol of independence, as a show of strength, of we are here, we do this with courage, with technology, and so almost you could say, like Ingrid already did, it's not different from here. It's not different from the West. Some of it is hated, some of it is loved. Why should it be different? Maybe the only difference that you do, what you can say is that the voice of the architect in the countries of Sub-Saharan Africa is weaker. Here we do have a certain kind of, through associations, through political standings, through initiatives, we can prevent a building to be torn down, whereas this is, I guess, but you tell me more, maybe it's a question also to you and your experience, is more difficult in the countries of Sub-Saharan Africa because the standing of the architectural kind of class or establishment is not so strong.
Yeah, I was going to, a bit what I brought up about the fact that, as you mentioned in the book, architecture being used as a kind of power tool at the time of changing of regimes. We see this from Brazil to Afrikaner architecture in South Africa. So that question of the role of the architect now, like who is building the new public spaces and sites in Africa now? And that's maybe something that I think could also have been touched on in the book, which is the new change of regime. And a lot of these buildings now are being built mostly by the Chinese. And that's having a big, influence in terms of, a big difference from today, from those days, was that those days, as you mentioned, there was very few local qualified architects. But now there's like hundreds. And these young architects who come out of the schools, what opportunities do they really have for experimenting? Of course, when you graduate, there's also a kind of a phase where you kind of develop your own style and maybe your own signature. So that's also, again, happening, that it's another change of regime. And so the local architects, again, are not really in a position to so easily come forward.
But I think that's a really interesting question. And in a way, it's sort of volume 2, and hopefully by someone else, because I think this is sort of a starting point for just what that conversation might be. I suppose, and this goes for even teaching in the UK, I would like that conversation to be about something other than facade, about ventilation, of position, of kind of commercial viability. And at the moment, I'm kind of, I suppose, nostalgic about a time when that conversation was, when we were in, particularly I suppose in Dakar, when you were talking to people who were trying to start the architecture school there. And these are people who had been through the independence movement. Their fathers or grandfathers had been the instrumental people in thinking about what architecture was as a political idea. And that isn't yet being, I suppose, reflected in the local archecture.
It's not part of the curriculum.
And maybe this is about bringing that back to the conversation within the university. And I think that's a really valid point.
I think that a very, if you are asking those questions to yourselves, I think it's a very interesting book and it's very needed. But at the same time, if you're asking these questions, I think a conversation like that in universities there would help to see okay, what are they teaching? I know the history they are teaching. And it is true that Chinese are building, but mostly are local people designing these buildings and, with the Chinese, let's say, right?
Yeah, often it's also just, somebody who's never set foot in Africa just draws something up and sends it over and that thing gets built,
But the thing is,
a whole airport in 6 weeks.
The same Africans that have been taught. What are they taught, right? What do they give importance to? Something that is
we are bringing the exhibition to the countries of Sub-Saharan Africa. It's going to travel to Nairobi and Dakar and to Johannesburg and Luanda and so on. Absolutely, that's.
buildings were still used in the way that they were designed for? Because you said some
Majority.
were squatted, but were others converted to different uses? I'm trying to judge whether the ideologies of some of them and the forms of social life or forms of political life they were supposed to represent or organise are still ongoing, or whether they've become obsolete
Well, I
or
think
just transformed.
I mean, most of the educational buildings are still in use and well loved. I mean, some of them exceptionally so. I think the Hotel Independence in Dakar was a management issue, and it fell between management. It was mismanaged initially, and at the moment it's suffering because it's a very cumbersome piece of architecture to restore, and I don't think there's the money to restore it to its former level. It only closed a few years ago. But in general, I think this is what's interesting, is the community centre that was built by Friar Drew, exceptional building. It's a sort of 1950s community centre, and I fear that if it was in some sort of part of London, it would probably be suffering the same fate. So I don't think it's unnecessarily sort of an African disregard for the modernist architecture, but a sort of, yes, a victim of
Or maybe
circumstance.
the social organisations.
And
were
the
supposed
social
to represent,
organisations,
yeah.
And another dimension, you mentioned it, that needs to be brought in is the role of the state. What we looked at, about 100 buildings, is almost all are public buildings, public institutions, because obviously kind of the argument was to look at how the state constructs itself through architecture. So we kind of caught architecture in for us at least, a beautiful moment where these very heroic structures were built not to kind of celebrate the private institutions or a company, but to celebrate the state, and ideally at least the public realm. And this came to a break in the 80s when most of the countries of Sub-Saharan Africa just couldn't afford it anymore, didn't build anymore. The public fell out as a client. And only after a break of, let's say, 10, 15 years was replaced by the private sector. So also a whole kind of tradition was cut. And I think this is one of the reasons of what you mentioned. This kind of awareness of the value of this architecture was also kind of, seizured, cut. Because there was a period of 10, 15 years where hardly anything was built.
Just had a quick question. I know, like you mentioned, like one of the images, like there's nothing more deliberate than a photograph. And one of the images you showed, like a Samsung advert in Lusaka. And I noticed, like in some of the images, like the top of the building would be cut off, like the KICC. So was that like a deliberate take on like cutting out like the neoliberal aspects of these kind of icons of independence? Because I know KICC, which is the skyline of Nairobi, can be seen from virtually anywhere in the city, and it's been branded by another Samsung logo.
Yeah, it's the same logo.
So is that like a deliberate take in like publishing a book to avoid this kind of neoliberal tendencies of these developing countries, or is it?
Can't see it. No, it's a great question. It's we don't have the image now on the computer, but if you would move up, I don't know, 6 floors, you would also get the same banner of Samsung on the top of the KICC and on the top of. Nothing is unintentional. Of course, there's a certain kind of humor. We don't need to over-interpret it, but of course, there's a certain kind of humor, or maybe also indication of the change of kind of going from public to private, where these monuments of national independence and nationalization, which this truly is, are now being the platforms for corporate, celebration. But in the end, it is photographs that want to show how the buildings are used today, how they choreograph a kind of urban dynamics, and this is part of it. We're not going to hide it.
But you know Lusaka, obviously.
Yeah, I'm from Nairobi.
Okay.
Because I knew the KICC from the branding.
Yeah.
So, like, I just noticed like in a few of the images.
I mean, I think I know there's one in the book, but the Cairo Road sits as a sort of edge to the city.
Right.
And there's this very strange moment to see this from the outskirts, very kind of popular lunch place, but that is really the edge of town. And there's some fantastic kind of geographical or geological reasons for that. So the sort of alarming nature of this very tall building with its, Samsung becomes the sort of literally the western edge of the city.
Right.
It's very, it's particularly acute in a place like Lusaka. Sorry.
Hello. I'm interested in the notion of African and if that's a meaningful construct, and if maybe we can think about how we represent African cities, and if you think perhaps these photographs is a useful representation, and is the term African, does it remain strategic and does it remain productive in thinking about a sort of a modernism or maybe an urbanism that's very specific to the continent, or is it something that's just part of a globalized, connected set of cities? And then also, is there any examples today of nation building in these cities or in maybe other cities across the continent, or maybe even in other cities that we can look to as examples? I think it's a very interesting concrete materiality that sits between all these examples. Thanks.
Yeah. I don't know if Rachel, you want to pitch in. Maybe just one aspect, looking back, kind of taking the historical part of your question. What was striking for us was you have different kind of currents, you have different kind of dynamics there, and you have this kind of internationalism of the architecture, an international style that is consciously chosen. On the other hand, it's consciously chosen also, I think, of the interest to meet other nations on eye level. We can do that now, so let's choose international architecture. On the other hand, there is the kind of obvious contradiction with the attempt to use this architecture as an expression of a new national identity. You have most of the architects coming from foreign countries, not only Britain and France, but also lots of Scandinavian architects, lots of Eastern Europe architects, lots of Israeli architects. You would expect a kind of globalization avant la lettre to take place there, to have the same buildings everywhere, but this is not the case. I mean, if you're from Nairobi, you might, and I don't know if you've been to Lusaka, but the same architects were sometimes building in Lusaka and in Nairobi, but Lusaka looks totally different, and the modernist architecture of Lusaka looks totally different from Nairobi, and a kind of a local style emerged or was produced that is independent of the kind of the hand of the architect, the voice of the architect. We see, Ingrid mentioned this in Senegal, a completely different style of architecture emerging, which has nothing to do with the buildings that were built in Abidjan, even though they were both former French colonies and in the same climate zones and with the same architects being present there. So we see a specificity emerge, which we find very interesting or quite stunning. But regarding, I don't know, this is your subject, the kind of urbanization and vis-a-vis globalization. Maybe you want to respond to the second part of the question.
Sure. I've noted down a few of the things you said. There was a few questions there. But, and I guess some of the responses I can give can be my own opinion. It's not necessarily what everybody else from Africa would agree with either. But maybe in the context of the book, I know that at the time there was a kind of strong Pan-Africanism push in terms of talking about coming together and reckoning together as a force. So I guess in this context, it's not out of place in that sense. And I guess nowadays, Ingrid mentioned a bit about kind of growing interest in kind of global urbanism, developments happening. And quite often the African story is told in terms of urbanism. And not so often do we get to hear the story told from Africans themselves on that global level, especially within the press and things like that. So I think that the book really marks a special moment in history, and it's really important to kind of record this to create a body. And I think we were talking about this earlier, that as soon as you got there, you just found out how this thing could just keep going and getting bigger and bigger. And I think that that's really positive that you know, whether there's plans in place now or not, it's something else, but that you're open to, and you see that this is how people have responded to you arriving and asking these questions. And maybe I will add my one tiny gripe, the fact that Lusophone Africa, you mentioned there that with the kind of recent, you know, the history after independence, it was kind of turbulent, but I still believe that there is, you know, a wealth of architectural works that are there, and you know, that kind of show these processes of independence. So maybe that's just to add in the whole Africa story. And the last one, the kind of contextualization, the photos that you were talking about, I think that's really important in terms of, again, in the context of this book, not just showing the kind of older pictures of the time that these, you know, European architects went out there and got this playground to go and do all these amazing things. Like, how are they actually in the spaces today, and not feel ashamed to show them that, yeah, we use the street in front for doing commerce and or for leisure, etc. This is how it is.
My question, okay, I've gone through the book, and one thing I've gone through the book, and one thing I realized about the book is a very good documentation of the buildings in Africa, but I can specifically talk about Kenya because I'm from Kenya, and I do understand the architecture of Kenya. One thing that I realized about the buildings and the time that they are documented, in history, that was the time the first architect from Kenya graduated from the School of Architecture. And it's the same time that he was the head of the local architectural office in Kenya. I think he has the number of 0051 or something like that. And when I look at the architecture that have been documented, it always has, for the buildings that have been documented in Kenya, it always has an history. If you look at the KCC, there's a lot of arguments about what the real concept is. They talk about a flower that is from, yes, he talks about a flower that is from the architect who was from Europe. But the architect in Kenya himself, who was called Mutise Mnenens, he says that it is a cone and a converted hut at the top. And this one is a traditional hut where Kenyatta was born, something like that. There's always that argument. And it's the same story that occurs in almost all the buildings. If you look at the Techno House that has been demolished, he says it's a tree. If you look at Wakulima House, he says there are many trees where people used to, all you need is a shed. Yeah, this one they always say it's a representation of a tree. And when you look at the Wakulima market, they always say there are many trees where people sit under a shed. And all these houses have a story.
Yeah.
They talk, when you ask the locals, is it the same thing that is happening in all these other countries? At what stage did an African architect be involved in maybe approvals of the drawings? Because I know for Kenya, it's almost the same time when an African architect was involved in the approval of drawings. When he was in the office, when he could give a go-ahead, yes, the building can be done or cannot be done. There was a little bit of, it was not a playing field per se, where you could just come and plant things, but there was some discussion that went through before something was built.
Yeah.
It's the time when architecture is a bit more planned than current, from my own point of view. Is the same happening in the other countries? At what point were architects involved in the approvals, and architects from Africa involved in the approvals?
That's a really difficult question to answer. Certainly, there's a tremendous amount of ambiguity about who is responsible for the design of many of the buildings that we've documented, and you'll see that if you go through the detail of the book. And in many cases, there are several architects involved, some of them local and some of them foreign. And I think that collaboration is very much present in a lot of the projects. But the first comment you make really fascinates me, and it's not a question, but I think there's another book in there, this idea of the kind of myth-making around architecture within an urban setting. the sort of metaphorical role of these buildings is an absolutely fascinating thing. I wasn't aware of that, so thank you.
I wanted to, it's not a clear question, maybe though everyone seems to be talking about, particularly now, the situation now or the future, we seem to be using the terms architecture and urbanism in the city almost interchangeably, and I wonder whether there's a bigger distinction to be made between architecture and urbanism, particularly with Thomas's point about nation building, or maybe now is a question of dealing with affairs of state or dealing with issues and things. And bring it back to the academia, because in the book you mentioned a lot the School of Tropical Architecture at the AA, and that being the seeds of a lot of this. And it was really sort of quite surprising for me to see that the seeds of the School of Tropical Architecture and Urbanism at the AA led to these kinds of buildings, because the course that I'm involved with, and a lot of people here involved with, is one of the branches of that school, and we tend to deal with or respond to conditions of informality, developing cities, rapid urbanization, etc., all around the world, but through urbanism. And architecture plays a role in that, but architecture seems to play a more instrumental role in that, in the kind of current discourse, as opposed to a role of embodiment and identity and some of the issues that you're talking about now. And it sort of, if you think of current work on Lagos or Brazil or Mexico City or stuff that we're involved with here, all tends to be about questions of kind of productive territories, about infrastructure, about kind of distribution of resources and things across the landscape systems. And that those are the tools that we use to address kind of current issues of states, of countries, of politics, rather than architecture itself. Or maybe we do talk about the architecture, but it becomes a tool in that rather than a kind of an expression of it. So if I were being provocative, I'd say, well, is architecture still relevant? Yeah, and I do remember sitting in or reading maybe a Rem Koolhaas article or comment that said maybe architecture isn't relevant to those issues, but it sort of, when you see it all here, it does seem alarmingly relevant. And maybe the book or the work that you're doing or the conversations that you're starting can bring maybe back that scale or that question of space and embodiment of an ideology and an idea. It was more, wondered what your comments or ideas on that were. Did you specifically think we're not going to look at infrastructure, we're not going to look at urbanism, we're not going to do any town planning?
Exactly. Yes. It's very easy to no, I mean, of course we acknowledge and we are aware of the incredible, first of all, fantastic literature that is produced, or architectural literature that is produced on these issues of urbanization, on infrastructure, the question of the territory, people as infrastructure, to quote Abdul Malik Simon, and so on. We know, or we know a little bit about it. We are aware of that. We are aware of the literature on informality and so on. The book was, I don't want to make it too simple, but there is a little bit of a I don't know, a reaction of spite or a counter-reaction to say, there is no informality in this book. It's not about informality, it's about formality. It's about the power of the state. It's not about, there has been so much written about exactly these things that you mentioned. Let's not get lost, or let's not lose sight of the whole other dimension of architecture, of a formal expression of means of shaping space. I think we sometimes celebrate informality too much. Anyway, it's a very debatable concept for me. And the book is somehow also, not only, but also a result of these thoughts.
But also, I think I could say something slightly even stronger. I think there's a sort of slightly patronizing aspect to the obsession with the informal and the obsession with basic need, as if Africa doesn't know how to make formal moves. And I think that felt very strong when the project started, to kind of recover a pride in a ability to make something exceptional that was not simply necessary.
There was an exhibition a year and a half ago, I think, in Munich, Afritecture, amazing title, which for once didn't focus on urbanization and cities, but focused on buildings. And what kinds of buildings it showed was, in the end, mostly, I don't know, slum upgrading, schools for children without parents, orphanages, and so on. And when you walked into the, I don't know, maybe some of you have seen it in uni, when you walked into the exhibition, you had to take your shoes off. And walk with your socks, because the floor was kind of covered with some kind of cardboard, and it indulged in this aesthetics of lack, one could say. No, and hey, let's construct our pedestals out of cardboard. And you think, no, it's like, why? Why do we need to take our shoes off when we go into an exhibition on architecture from Africa, when we come in suit and tie, when it's about an exhibition of architecture in, I don't know, France? It's so respectless. And that's also maybe a reason why the exhibition architecture is as formal as it gets. It's super rigid, the design for the exhibition that we did, to get away as far as possible from this idea of you have to take your shoes off. No, please don't.
I mean, I think, again, it's perhaps it's not a rejection of all of this work. I'm going to sort of pedal back slightly now. But an attempt to readdress the balance more than anything.
Yeah, it seems to me like just it makes palpable questions of space, identity, image, dwelling, all sorts of things that maybe aren't really the forefront of the discussion or weren't until you did this book. And I think that's great. It'd be nice to sort of see some of the more emblematic projects, thinking of your colleagues, Billenberg's vertical gyms and things, but photographed and dealt with in these ways, rather than as kind of concepts or drivers for change in a certain kind of urban logic or systemic logic, just to see them as spaces and materials and peoples and identities and things.
Maybe if I can just add, your question about if architecture is relevant, I guess, looking to the time of the book, the development agenda was really different then.
Exactly,
it was very much about kind of stating your identity and who you are within the world. And now, as we see the biggest, migration and urbanization happening across the world, the agenda is kind of changing to, dealing a lot with people's aspirations of what a city, and a lot of the things that you talk about, questions which are happening all over the world, what a city should be, and how it should fulfill, the aspirations of the people within it, and that's here and everywhere else.
I was wondering whether you had any observations on tensions that arose between the transnational practice of this form of architecture in post-colonial countries as they went into newly independent states and were trying to then develop their own sense of national identity. I've been looking at the work of Michel Leclerchat, and he was the head of urban development and architecture in Senegal, just in the newly independent country. And a lot of his work, so he was doing the redevelopment of Dakar, which was sponsored by a French aid company, which in turn was then financed by an investment bank. So of course there was a huge amount of kind of political backlash within that, where they would come in and at one point they completely altered one of his plans, moving the, he built a huge housing estate, I believe for like 30,000 people, but then had the economic centre, the French aid company, then moved to the other side of a motorway, meaning it was inaccessible. And this was without his consultation. And there was all these kind of tensions coming up because of foreign investment, because these countries were still so reliant on their colonial countries from before independence, and having very little of their own expertise within the country because of that process, and were still then relying on the expertise of Europe and of the West. And I was wondering if you had any kind of examples or any observations of where this tension came up in the architecture and where they were still political tools post-independence.
I think they're probably all political tools in some way. I think that it's the degree to which they're exercised. This is a rather lame answer, but I remember a few reviews ago, sort of Daryl commenting that, every aspirational housing development starts with how much car parking can one kind of extract from the plan. And I think that, I suppose there's a tremendous, it would be unwise to idealize the process. I mean, I think as much as it's wonderful that there is a collaboration between the so-called West or the European kind of former colonial masters and local architects, that those processes were driven by large amounts of funding, which was not necessarily in anyone's particular interest. And this, I think, goes back to the kind of Alex's question as to what extent are we looking at those kind of examples of architecture for their own merit, and to what extent are they situated within a very, very messy political spectrum that then starts to expand into a very, very messy urban kind of planning issue. The history of these cities and how they developed is fraught. And I suppose that if we considered all of these things, we would have only really been able to look at one or two buildings. And I think that to a certain extent, the book approaches things with a certain level. It's like a slice through a certain kind of, through an architecture at a very particular height, so to speak.
Section.
It's a section, and that's it. I think it's and then fruit for further work, hopefully.
I don't know how we're doing with time. Maybe we take one or two more questions, and then we give the opportunity to buy the book.
And have a drink, and ask more on a more informal level.
Yeah.
But,
This building here is what's called the Florida nightclub, but it's since been torn down.
yeah.
Yes.
Are there sort of listing guidances and regulations that keep these buildings, that can preserve these buildings? And would this book perhaps be a useful document to present to governments to say maybe some of these buildings are worth maintaining, and then being useful to education schools in teaching the future architects, the local architects in these cities?
I don't know, Rachel, do you have any? You've been involved in this to a certain extent.
Well, yeah, I just know that from particularly in Mozambique, the case there is very much that the architecture school is kind of pushing. They've made actually a list of 30 buildings. They've narrowed it down to 30 most important, like, do not touch buildings, but they've been campaigning for quite a while now to get them kind of protected, but that still hasn't happened. But I don't know your experience in other countries, if it's developed that far. But I think that there's also a whole debate in terms of how you define what is of cultural heritage or importance, you know, and I know quite often, you know, the kind of Docomomo doctrine of kind of, you know, we see this as important, kind of top-down approach, so we have to protect it in this way. And yeah, it's a debate, and I guess, like I'm highlighting in the Docomomo case, it's one that all over the world, how do you deal with, you know, appropriation, perhaps even. The other day I was learning about, and I didn't know, the whole skate park, which is at the South Bank. You know, so, you know, how do you protect this building, but these people are using it, and then now there's all these questions about urban commons, and so it's a debate which I guess, but sure, the book, I think, will be very useful. I mean, the correspondence you said, the email that you received, kind of just dismissing it. I think when you get something like this, it shows that it matters, as opposed to just easily sidestepping it. Nobody cares because nobody's talking or looking towards it.
Yeah, that's also a reason why we are super eager to bring it to the countries of Sub-Saharan Africa to have a larger impact there, to anchor it locally.
I think also there's a lot of research projects that are raising the status of these buildings, and certainly there's some excellent archivists who are just beginning to try and pull together information on particular architects, and to me that's kind of the first stage, you know, because a lot of this stuff, a lot of the archival information's been lost, but where it can be recovered, it becomes the basis for a renewed understanding, and again this kind of attempt to, I suppose, edit or curate what is important within the city, probably again starts from a research process. And I think that, again, hopefully that this begins to spark a few research ideas that allow that kind of layered protection of a building through its understanding.
But maybe also just like learning from other nations. Just now I was thinking that when I've done a trip to Casablanca, Morocco, there, in terms of, you know, the way that they actually even use today former abattoir, which has been turned into a kind of cultural center, which is used by the local people in the community, and, you know, so they are, you know, really excellent examples that actually anywhere in the world could learn from how other people have done it. But they are definitely places which are further advanced with this kind of approach than others.
if there is one last. Oh, there's none. There is.
I was just going to ask, where do you see, in the eventuality of this research going further, where do you see this going? In the sense that I see, what I understand from it is that there's an interest out of the ordinary buildings, that with the clear intention of building up an identity within Africa. And so I'm just wondering whether, is it about actually documenting ignored buildings within the continent of Africa, or are you planning on expanding to even other areas or something?
I think it's also for other people to take it on. It's really what Ingrid said. What would be the most amazing thing that could happen is that, I don't know, 80 PhDs are the result of this book, where everyone picks a building and you can write a PhD on every single building of this book. I mean, we are aware of the huge gaps. There's so many countries, you mentioned Lusophone Africa, so many countries that we didn't look at, that we kind of had to ignore, because eventually you have to make a choice, and every choice is to a certain extent arbitrary. We never went to Nigeria, we didn't go to DRC, Tanzania is missing, and so on. But it's in a discourse that is emerging, that is becoming stronger, and other people are picking it up. And what is, I think, important is that this discourse shifts the view that we from the West have on this continent of Africa, usually having seen it or still seeing it much more in terms of plight, of lack, of problems, of violence. We finally acknowledge the incredible cultural production, and this is kind of part of a larger discourse which shifts this view on the African continent.
And I think I'd really like to take up your offer. I think actually using this as a way of thinking about pedagogy in Africa, I think is incredibly important. Raising the status. I know that maybe Bob has some comments on that when we have a drink, but great.
Maybe just to add a bit to what you were saying, in that I think now that, for instance, I know that The Guardian has established like a series, so and I see there that aside from the kind of niche market of architects, there is spurning something which can lead to a kind of wider, different imagination. But I think it would also be key to maybe think about how these are things which, aside from the kind of work I've been doing before, how to maybe raise also the profile of a lot of the African architects. Yeah. I understand that Hannah Leroux wrote a chapter, and I still feel that maybe a bit more visuals could have been used to show, some of the kind of radical work that Demas and Woko and some of these other architects were displaying and doing and experimenting and coming up with really kind of a localized African identity of sorts, but yeah.
You're absolutely right. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your interest. Thank you.